Imagine you're watching The Matrix, and that scene comes on where Morpheus is giving Neo two choices, the blue pill or the red pill. This scene is so iconic that most people know which pill Neo takes, but what would happen if he took the blue pill instead and chose to remain in Wonderland? Well, there is no need for a spoiler alert because there wouldn't even be a movie. As a matter of fact, almost all of the most popular stories we love feature a protagonist challenging the status quo. Author Joseph Campbell popularized the concept of the hero's journey, where every single hero is faced with a choice, to remain the same or challenge the status quo. Thinking about our own decisions, do you ever wonder why we stick to old habits, even if it seems there might be a better way? Is your brain tricking you into playing it safe? The short answer is yes. Our brains are actually wired to resist change due to a cognitive bias called the status quo bias. In this multi-part series, I'm going to discuss several cognitive biases that negatively impact the quality of our decisions. Being able to identify cognitive biases and reduce their impact is a skill that will help you become a much more effective leader and ultimately a more successful manager or business owner. I am Nick McLean with 4 Pillars Investors. After almost 20 years in the industry, I can say that so much of the success and failure in private equity depends on making good decisions around what companies to buy, the price and structure of those transactions, and how to grow the business. Before we start discussing the first bias, it might help to answer the question, what exactly is a cognitive bias? Wikipedia describes a cognitive bias as a systematic pattern of deviation from norm or rationality in judgment. The concept here is that a bias develops because people will develop constructions of reality based on their own and others' perceptions and experiences. With that out of the way, let's learn more about the status quo bias. On a deal we were working on in the quick service restaurant space, we were confronted with a real-life example of the status quo bias. Each franchisee in the system has the right to set prices in their stores, regardless of what the franchisor recommends. Initially, the process would require the franchisee to take an action to implement price changes suggested by the franchisor. Acceptance rates were low. In order to combat this, the franchisor started implementing the price change and requiring the franchisee to take an action in order to reverse the price change. By making this switch, the franchisor had established a new status quo. Accordingly, a very low percentage chose to revert to former prices. This is a textbook example of the status quo bias and is perhaps the most widespread bias I come across when working with owners of small to medium-sized businesses. Perhaps self-explanatory, but the status quo bias is the tendency to choose options or solutions that are most similar to how it is now. As I will describe later, the status quo bias can be caused by a few different underlying biases. Regardless, this bias also happens to be a personal favorite of mine, for lack of a better word. I say that because one of the 4 pillars in our name is challenge the status quo. One of the reasons we chose this is because growth is one of the primary goals, if not the number one goal we have for our portfolio companies. Growth doesn't happen by doing things the same way. Challenging the status quo requires change. The quote that perhaps has been misattributed to Albert Einstein applies here. Change is hard though. Most folks are resistant to it, some very much so. We definitely do not want to implement change just for the sake of change. So in order to evaluate where we should focus our efforts, we at 4 Pillars tend to ask a lot of questions. One question that we ask repeatedly and in numerous situations is, why do you perform that task the way you do? Sometimes we get the dreaded, because that's the way it has always been done. That's an acceptable answer for some folks within the organization because, after all, no one would want an entire organization to be comprised of change agents. However, what we are trying to avoid is a culture that doesn't change, even though it needs to. An underlying principle that will hinder efforts to change is the existence bias. The existence bias suggests that people judge the current state to be better than it actually is. What's more, The current state will be judged to be even better the longer it has been that way. What a strong force at play helping ensure processes never change. In addition to the existence bias, another potential reason is the principle of loss aversion. Generally speaking, people are more likely to focus on what might be lost instead of what might be gained. In our video on the randomness of the stock market, I discussed a study in which folks were asked to play a game that involved the flipping of a coin. The question posed to the study participants was how much you would have to win if the losing amount were $100. In many studies, the average amount indicated was $250. In other words, participants needed to have the potential to win $2.50 for each $1 they stood to lose. I often think about these principles in the context of the need to make an expenditure in order to grow your business. In this context, the fear of losing money by making that expenditure oftentimes will outweigh the perceived benefits. Another principle at work is the mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect manifests itself by making us feel more comfortable choosing something that we have more exposure to. In other words, we get comfortable with the people we are working with, the customers we are serving, the resources required, the vendors we work with, our daily routine, etc. Changing any one of those requires us to venture into territory that is less familiar. Finally, the endowment effect is a powerful force that might be at play. This effect primarily is described in the context of physical assets. The concept is that folks will more highly value an asset they own than an identical asset that they do not. The endowment effect is huge in the process of buying and selling companies. There is an analogy I often share with the sellers that is an example of this. Let's say your neighbor really likes the car you drive. Over the course of a few years, he's told you repeatedly that he would like to buy your car when you sell it. Well, you are finally ready to sell, and you tell your neighbor. He offers $5,000, and you want $10,000. Each of you get upset because you each thought the sale was a certainty. I also think this applies to people and vendors. If I have an employee that is just average, I might rate that employee more highly than I should. In this example, I am overvaluing a current asset, albeit a human asset and not a physical one. That's not to imply the endowment effect is the only bias that might be at play here, though. In one of our portfolio companies, the former owner resisted efforts and requests from a customer to increase capacity and capabilities. This person might have had numerous reasons for resisting these efforts. After we purchased the company and started building a relationship with the customer, we learned that they had been looking to replace us because the company hadn't been willing to grow with them. The owner got out in time and we saved the relationship, but had the owner not sold when he did, the value of his business would have dropped precipitously, perhaps to the point where he couldn't even sell it and instead had to shut it down. He avoided major harm from his status quo bias, but not everyone will be that lucky. As a quick test to see who's been paying attention, which underlying bias or biases do you think drove the owner to act in the way he did? A. Existence bias. B. Loss aversion. C. Mere exposure effect. Or D. Endowment effect. Though perhaps I haven't painted the picture well enough for the audience to answer that question, but my belief is that the primary mechanism was the existence bias. The owner felt that the current state was irrationally good, even though he was at risk of losing a major customer. A case could be made for the endowment effect as well. If so, the asset being overvalued would be customer relationships. Not to make this about me personally, but I am very comfortable with change. In fact, the mere thought of a routine 8-to-5 job stresses me out. Additionally, I do believe that one of the core values of our firm, challenge the status quo, is also a personal core value. Even with that openness and willingness to change, I still find myself suffering from this bias. For example, I am reluctant to change vendors or to move on from employees. I know part of that is due to loyalty, but there are irrational forces at play here as well. Usually, in my case, I think it is mere exposure effect, meaning that familiarity breeds comfort. I offer that as support that even the most resistant to the status quo will resist change in certain circumstances. So if folks that seek change will seek to maintain the status quo in certain circumstances, just think for a moment how powerful this bias will be for folks in the middle or even the other end of the continuum, and you will see how debilitating this bias can be. Staying comfortable and maintaining the status quo should not be taken lightly. Some of the biggest companies in the world have been wiped out because of this. Kodak was a dominant player in the photography industry, primarily focusing on film-based photography. Despite inventing the first digital camera in 1975, Kodak chose to suppress this technology to protect its film business. The company was deeply invested in the status quo of film photography and was reluctant to shift its focus to digital. Kodak failed to adapt quickly, leading to significant decline in its market share and eventual bankruptcy filing in 2012. As another example, Nokia was a global leader in the mobile phone market, known for its durable and user-friendly handsets. Nokia was slow to transition from feature phones to smartphones, underestimating the impact of Apple's iPhone and Google's Android operating system. The company relied heavily on its existing Symbian operating system and was reluctant to innovate rapidly. As the smartphone market expanded, Nokia lost significant market share to competitors who embraced the new technology. Nokia's decline led to the sale of its mobile phone business to Microsoft in 2013. There are many more examples of businesses, such as Borders, IBM in the PC market, BlackBerry, and more. What are some examples you know of? I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. A big part of this bias is simply how you frame it. So perhaps you should stay on my channel and watch this video to maintain the status quo. Up next in the series, I will share one reason why folks hold on to certain beliefs amid a sea of conflicting and inconsistent information. Stay tuned. If you are a business owner that's having trouble deciding if private equity is a good exit option for you, click the link below to schedule some time to talk with me directly.